Hello, I'm Refguee, and this is Scope. Today we're going to be discussing the refugee issue. At a time when that crisis is getting more attention, questions about those who are economic migrants versus genuine asylum seekers fleeing persecution come to the fore. On top of that, successive scandals have hit organizations who claim to help refugees, from sexual abuse to financial corruption. Let's now watch a video put together by the United Nations Refugee Agency that puts into context the global refugee issue.
Faces of those forced to flee in staggering numbers. 2016 was the third successive record-breaking year. One person is forcibly displaced every 3 seconds. That's 65.6 million people. 22.5 million refugees, the highest number ever recorded. 40.3 million displaced inside their own country. On average, 1 in every 113 people is now displaced, equal to the 20th most populous country in the world, bigger than Britain. Some crises, Somalia, Afghanistan, Myanmar, stretch over decades. Others accelerated this century. Democratic Republic of Congo, the north of Central America, Iraq, Syria. 2/3 of its people are now displaced. In 2016, new crises erupted in Nigeria and South Sudan. South Sudan, the world's newest nation trapped in war and famine, and the fastest growing displacement crisis anywhere. In 2016, over 700,000 people fled to Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Kenya. The total of refugees from South Sudan is now more than 1.9 million. Since 2013, another 1.9 million people have been displaced inside the country. Sarah fled famine and fighting.
There is a lot of war, people are dying. That's why we come to Juba. I just pray, let them make peace. Let us go back to our motherland.
It falls to neighboring, often poor or middle-income countries to host these millions of displaced. Turkey, more than 2.9 million. Pakistan, 1.6 million. Lebanon, over 1 million. Uganda, over 900,000. Many remained for years. The number of people seeking asylum stood at 2.8 million in 164 countries. 75,000 were children on their own, and 1 of every 2 refugees is a child. In 2016 was the year 193 nations committed to a renewed approach to these ongoing crises. They signed the New York Declaration to intensify their cooperation to protect and to find solutions for refugees. The key goals: more investment in refugee hosting communities, fostering refugee inclusion through jobs, education, and opportunities, continued commitment to resettlement, new pathways to solutions.
All right, that was a short video prepared by the UN's Refugee Agency that puts into context really how dire the situation of refugees around the world really is. Let's discuss this topic a bit further and open it up to our guests. We're joined by Ms. Gwen Robinson, who is originally from Thailand, or is based in Thailand, I should say, pardon me, but is currently in Myanmar. She's the editor-at-large of the Nikkei Asian Review. Gwen, thank you for taking your time out to join us here in the Scope. Gwen, I know that you are in Myanmar on the ground currently. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the issue of Rohingyas, their repatriation, etc.
Well, just to update, as viewers may know, there was due to be a repatriation begin of more than, well, conservatively, at least 1 million Rohingya refugees who are currently inside the Bangladesh border with Myanmar. And that was due to begin in late November. And of course, that did not happen because not one refugee volunteered to return. There are huge concerns about their safety if they come back. I think the world knows the horrendous crackdown that drove a lot of these people out in last year. But there were successive earlier waves of violence, and so, Bangladesh has been taking Rohingya refugees for quite a long time now. And I think right now, all donor countries, international agencies are all looking at each other saying, well, what next? Nobody wants to see the prospect of miserable refugees being forced back. And in fact, it would violate Bangladesh's treaty obligations to protect refugees. So I think right now it's a very uncertain situation. Nobody really wants to talk about it inside Myanmar. There's a huge reluctance, of course, to accept them back, but officially the government is going through the motions to, say they're ready to take them back. Approved refugees can be brought back. They've prepared reception centres, which media reports have suggested are little better than concentration camps. And nobody really knows when this process will begin.
You spoke about the fact that Bangladesh, of course, has to and should be abiding by, of course, its responsibilities vis-a-vis international law. But as you well can imagine, Gwen, Bangladesh may look to the rest of the world and say, why aren't other countries doing more at this point to help it? Because Bangladesh is not, of course, a developed country. It's still a developing country itself. This is a lot of pressure, isn't it, on the neighbors of Myanmar and others?
Well, it's huge, but as you showed in the video that began the program, the level of refugees worldwide is now at a record numbers, and there's huge demand. Syrians, Sudan, and now on top of this, more than 1 million Rohingya. So I think the world's resources and perhaps patience for shelling out to accommodate refugees is wearing thin, and this is a huge problem for the countries such as Bangladesh, which itself is desperately poor to actually pay for the shelter and protection and safety of these refugees. So I think, as you say, it's a huge problem, and up to recently, I think there was actually a brewing emergency for this year in huge shortfall in funding to even keep feeding and caring for more than at least 750,000 in the wave of refugees that came over last year alone in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar. So it is a huge problem, and frankly, meanwhile, the international community is now in full swing, demanding retribution, accountability. There have been moves to prosecute those responsible at the ICC, International Criminal Court. So there's a lot of surface noise about beginning a process of accountability, retribution. At the same time, I think the real emergency is getting worse and worse, which is that, countries of the world should really be standing up and thinking about, putting more money into to help these countries that are trying to accommodate all these people. And you heard the numbers of Syrian refugees alone. It's just in the millions. So I think that's a real problem. And Myanmar now still hosts some camps for earlier waves of Rohingya refugees who are still in Rakhine State in camps. So even Myanmar itself, which expelled a lot of them in the most brutal circumstances, is still hosting, I think at least a couple of 100,000.
Okay.
So it's a real issue.
Right. Let me try to see if we can bring in Kaiser Afridi, the spokesperson for UNHCR Pakistan, who is joining us now from Islamabad, into this conversation. Kaiser, thank you for joining us. Kaiser, as you well know, of course, Pakistan hosts quite a significant number of refugees, and there are a significant amount of IDPs within this country as well. Just give us an overview, if you can, about the UN's activities in providing for those refugees and the challenges that you may face.
Thank you so much. In a world we have today, if we turn on the TV today, there are conflicts, destruction, war, people on the move. There are non-state actors involved in these war and fighting. So they are challenging, affecting our lives. So globally, I would talk about refugees and the displaced people. I mean, there are 68.5 million people who are displaced. Every 2 seconds, there is one person being displaced. Around 44,000 people are being displaced every month. So, I mean, the challenge is that 85% of these displaced people are being hosted by developing countries. If you could see the trend, I mean, Turkey is the top host country, which is hosting 3.5 million refugees, followed by Pakistan and Uganda, which is Pakistan is hosting 1.4 million Afghan refugees, and then Uganda and Lebanon is hosting 1 million refugees, and then Iran is hosting 900,000 refugees. So, I mean, if you could see, the top refugee-producing countries include Syria, which has produced 6.3 million refugees, followed by Afghanistan, which has produced so far 2.6 million, 6 million people, followed by Sudan. So if we see the trend, I mean, there are displacement and there is no political solution in place. So in this region, I would focus on this region, the Afghan displacement. As you know, that UNHCR is tasked to support the emerging problems in conflict and find solutions to the protracted situation, solutions. So many people here, they ask question that there is no light at the end of the tunnel. The Afghan caseload, if you see, I mean, there are 1.4 million Afghan refugees Pakistan is hosting, but I would say that 4.4 million Afghan refugees have gone back to Afghanistan under the UNHCR facilitated voluntary return program.
Right.
The country is still hosting 1.4 million, and in 2017, last year, the government of Pakistan they adopted a comprehensive policy on the management of Afghan nationals, for the management of Afghan nationals.
Right.
There are 4 elements, basically. The first element is the introduction of a flexible visa regime. The second element was documenting the undocumented Afghans. So last year, in 2017, in August, in the month of August and July, the government of Pakistan started a program to document these Afghans who are living on the territory of Pakistan.
Right.
So they have registered 880,000 Afghans, and they were issued and are being issued Afghan citizen cards. The third element is the enactment of national refugee law. Pakistan, actually, let me tell you that Pakistan doesn't have a refugee law. So we are working with the government for this, so that the government could do legislation and enact a refugee law, so that they are able to determine the status of the refugee. And the fourth and most important point is the border management. Before 2016, the border was porous. I mean, people would travel back and forth, and 40 to 50,000 people would cross the border. But now the government has managed so far, I mean, the Turkmen border, and now an Afghan or a Pakistani should have a valid visa and passport to travel to Afghanistan or to travel to Pakistan. So they are managing the border.
Okay.
So these are the 4 elements, and at the same time, we have this solution strategy for Afghan refugees endorsed by the international community.
Right.
It was endorsed supported by the international community, and the thing is that we are trying to advocate. We are advocating that here the international community should focus on Afghanistan and provide targeted development assistance in Afghanistan So, for example, if Afghan refugees opt to go back to Afghanistan, the return should be, sustainable and
okay, Kaiser,
sustainable.
if you just allow me to come in, because I want to pick up on a few of the points you've made there, and very important points that Kaiser there made, Gwen, about, again, looking towards the international community, and that's it we spoke about as well, Gwen. And I'm wondering, the international community may turn around and say to all of these refugees, and these very different refugees of different cases, such as the Afghan refugees that we've talked about just right now, and as you've spoken about the Rohingyas in Bangladesh as well, the international community maybe are like, we're getting pulled in different directions. What is in your opinion, do you think, what is an organized fashion of approaching this entire issue? What should that look like, do you think, on the part of the international community?
There is no one model, and each situation is so different. Some involve military violence, others involve, natural disasters. They're very different. But I think an issue that I should have mentioned earlier, and I'd be interested what my fellow discussant has to say about it, but I think one of the huge issues is internal displacement, not just talking about borderlands and repatriation to back to a country of origin. We're talking about internal displacement. So of the now record number of refugees worldwide, I think it's now nearly 70 million, it's 68 million. 2/3 of these are internally displaced, and some of the worst situations we're seeing, like Yemen, these are all internal displacement. So that's an issue in itself. And the other issue is statelessness, which I think is a real category within the global refugee situation. So Rohingya, for example, have no status. They have no identity, and that's a real problem because that means no country claims them. There's nowhere to go home to. They are not citizens of anywhere. Right. I think there's at least 17 or more peoples like that who have no status. So I'd say that, your point is very good about, how do you bring all this together? But given the disparate nature of all these situations, I think it's actually impossible to come up with a formula. And I think, the international agencies such as UN agencies involved in trying to resolve these situations are really facing an increasingly tougher and tougher problem in trying to resolve these issues in a kind of coordinated way where countries involved and concerned and also on the doorstep of a lot of these areas it can sign off on it and have a common agreement. And you can see what's happening. I think the Rohingya is a very good example of a situation where you've got the geographic placement of Myanmar between all these different countries, India, China, Bangladesh, Thailand on the other side, a variety of countries. Right. And yet, you cannot come up with an acceptable solution to all. And there's huge resistance on both sides about repatriation. So okay, I think...
let me bring in Kaiser Khan, if I may, Gwen. Kaiser, I'm wondering, when you look at, as Gwen mentioned, even internally displaced people, and we know that there are a number of them as well in Pakistan, how is the UN dealing with that situation?
Well, the internally displaced people, there were millions of people displaced from time to time during floods, during earthquake, and then the conflict IDPs. The UNHCR and the UN agencies, in general, we were supporting these IDPs, internally displaced people. And we were providing them shelter, camp management, and we were leading basically the camp management, providing shelters, non-food items, and we were basically registering them and providing protection to these IDPs. So most of these IDPs have returned to their areas of origin, and we were very active, and we were at APAR, we were helping them. So this is a problem, as she has already said, that 40 million of the displaced people are internally displaced people. Right. 40 million are the internally displaced people. Yeah, so we are committed to provide support to the uprooted people, and
Okay, so Kaiser,
we
before I know because you have a tight schedule as well, Kaiser. Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you. There are questions sometimes, Kaiser, about not specifically talking about Pakistan, but just in general about those who run refugee camps or those who are responsible for taking care of refugees. There are questions sometimes about scandals that may erupt. We, as you well know probably, Kaiser, about the scandal that has erupted in Uganda. And then we had this scandal a number of years ago, I believe, in the Democratic Republic of Congo as well, where there's exploitation of these refugees, be it through rape or sexual abuse or even just financial corruption as well. Kaiser, just tell us about what mechanisms, if there are any, that the United Nations has to hold those people accountable and to protect refugees from such a situation.
We have a proper mechanism in place to tackle such situation, including sexual harassment and corruption. And we have actually zero tolerance for such things. And we have proper system mechanism in place to investigate such things, yeah.
Very well, Kaiser. We'll leave it there at that. I know that you have to go, but of course we appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us in this. Gwen, I'll go back to you, Gwen, and I'll put the same question to you that I put to Kaiser about the many scandals that we see coming out. You may have heard of the scandal in Uganda where a UN audit has found misconduct, basically, and how its refugee camps in that country were being run. A lot of financial corruption, ghost refugees, Ugandan infrastructure being built with money that was meant to go to refugees in that country. And of course, Uganda hosts quite a significant amount of them, as that video earlier showed as well. Just on this general issue, Gwen, about corruption and sexual abuse, et cetera, within such camps, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a very good point, but I think that we're talking about, they are such different things. So corruption, we've seen it right through the world, particularly in developing countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees and getting huge inflows of, donor money. Generally, international agencies are much, supposedly much tighter at monitoring and requiring accountability for, this expenditure of funds. But if you look at the sheer number of agencies involved in, say, an operation like Syrian refugees in some of these countries that host a lot of them, or, for example, in places any large body of refugees, you're going to have a problem because there's a lot of NGOs, there's a lot of international NGOs as well. Accountability is an issue, and I think there is a lot of graft and corruption, even down to the grassroots level where bags of food, stamped with WFP or something are ending up in, places that are nothing to do with refugees. The other issue is protection, which is huge, and I think I'm glad you brought it up, because I don't think that is just a situation where you've got refugees at the hands of peacekeepers or other international bodies that should be protecting them, but instead end up like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, shocking reports of abuse. But actually inside, I'll go back to the Rohingya example again because I'm in Myanmar, but in Bangladesh, inside the camps, there's a growing number of reports. You've got nearly 1 million people sort of living in this completely packed, rather sort of destitute sort of situation. There's a lot of sexual violence, abuse, reports of young girls being married off, domestic violence. And at night, all the international aid workers go home. The camp is locked up. There's little electricity and, there's no protection for these people. But I think that's a step too far for a host country like Bangladesh that is struggling to even, keep these people alive. So I do think that's a real issue that, again, and I think the international agencies are well aware of this issue, and it goes on all over the world, the need for better and more protection of refugees.
She was speaking to us from Myanmar, and she is the editor-at-large of the Nikkei Asian Review. As Gwen there mentioned, and as Kaiser there mentioned as well, of course there are challenges when it comes to these camps as they exist right now, especially those that are in developing countries, and of course for the lack of international support at this point in time, or enough international support, I should say. And of course, there are many concerns, be it corruption, be it sexual abuse. What does happen, as Gwen said, once those camps are locked up at night? What happens within those camps? Why aren't those people protected better by the international community? The host countries, many of times, do not have the resources in place to be able to protect these people sufficiently. We'll be right back, though, after a short break with more on that topic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're still continuing our discussion about refugees. And we've, of course, been discussing with our esteemed guests in the previous segment about that issue about refugee camps, etc. In this segment, we're going to be discussing refugees going forward with Mr. Asif Munir, who is joining us live from Dhaka. He's a migration and displacement analyst, and he has professional experience of working within the United Nations system. We're also joined by Mr. Mir Wais Khan, who is a journalist joining us from Islamabad, and he's has seen or has experience observing, of course, the refugee situation in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan regarding Afghan refugees specifically. Asif, I'll start with you, if I may. When we look at the issue of refugees, obviously it's quite a vast one, Asif, but one of the challenges remains that who runs these refugee camps and these agencies that do run the entire system of how refugees are dealt with around the world. Challenges such as, for example, as you may or may not know, Asif, about the issue that's come up in Uganda, for example, financial corruption within the UN refugee camps there. How do you believe such challenges should be tackled going forward?
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of the UN system, there is a recognition that there are issues, internal issues to look at in terms of either corruption or even in terms of abuse. Some certain UN agencies have come up with sort of zero tolerance policies and where conflict of interest, how they deal with that. But of course, each agency is very big and some of these operations are big. So it may be really difficult for them to internally resolve all these issues. There needs to be sort of like some kind of a watchdog role from, like, sometimes UN agencies or rights groups have a watchdog role in terms of the government. Now, in terms of the UN agencies and humanitarian agencies, perhaps the government probably has to have a watchdog role in terms of looking at what are the issues that they need to resolve in terms of actually supporting the people they support.
Okay, so Mir Wais, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who's observed how refugees are dealt with, what's your experience been vis-a-vis the challenges that lie ahead and the challenges that remain when it comes to dealing with refugees as a whole?
Yeah, thank you for calling me. And the refugee problem is very well known by the Pakistanis because there are more than 2.7 million refugees in Pakistan. And the problem is that there is no proper arrangement for the refugees, and it affects a lot. Because if you see in Islamabad, there were different points where the refugees were living. Now they are moved out from those places. So there is no permanent solution for the refugees. There are no permanent laws and strategies for the refugees. So it will increase because there is no proper medical facilities for them. There is no proper education system for them. Though Pakistan government is trying a lot to do that, but unfortunately the UN agencies move through American policies, which is not good. So which affects Afghan refugees who are here in Pakistan. So that's a problem because the UN should not move with American policies. They have suspended some of the funds of Afghan refugees because the Pakistan and America got relation is not in a good space. So which affects the Afghan refugees fund too over here.
Asif, that's a good point, and I want to put that to you. I know you're not a spokesperson for the UN, but just in general, do you think that politics does come in the way of how refugees are dealt with?
It does. I mean, in terms of course, when it represents different countries in terms of the donations and the contributions or the policy making, of course, it's US, but also some other countries as well, the superpowers. But in terms of if you talk about politics, it's the country politics as well. I mean, UN agencies work within a parameter of whichever country they're working in. the governance issues of that particular country, laws apply for that particular country as well, and their own laws. So, it's a mix of the laws and the political situation of the particular country, but also in terms of the agencies themselves and the the decision-making process within these agencies. Having worked in Bangladesh with the UN, I have worked with different UN agencies at different times, and seen some of the humanitarian work, but also by NGOs, local, international. It's difficult to really put it into a straitjacket that, a lot of things go on which are not right. Certain things are right, certain things are not, but I would come back to the point that I was mentioning, that there needs to be some kind of, the accountability mechanisms, that if the things don't go right, there needs to be some kind of accountability for the agencies as well as for the government. And the politics of a particular country does play a role in terms of how the UN agencies would operate.
Okay, we have another voice joining us to add to this conversation. We're joined by Irfan Ahmed Awan, who is from Kuwait, and he's the Managing Director of the Society for Community Strengthening and Promotion of Education. And he's worked quite closely with the education sector in Balochistan, specifically with refugees since 2002. Irfan, thank you for joining us in the scope. Irfan, I wanted to get your opinion and your experience, if you can share that with us, of working to get education to refugees there.
As you know that Balochistan is hosting the refugees since more than 3 decades. And refugees are here in Balochistan in 10 refugee villages, and some are dispersed in the urban suburbs. Education is a big challenge at the refugee camp level, because the refugees opt to take their education in their own curriculum and in their own medium of instruction, that is Pashto and Dari. And we are assisting them since last 20 years to manage their education in their own curriculum. And that is one of the aspects which is helping the refugees to build their capacity and to focus on the education and to get into the mainstream when they back to their own country.
Okay, so Mirwais, I wonder what your experience has been and what you've observed when it comes to education and the challenges that shows for the Pakistani government or other governments really to provide that sort of education for refugees here.
I will respond to both of my friends over there who was talking about related to UN. Unfortunately, as I told before, that we should not mix the UN policies with politics, but we do. Now, I can give an example that over here in Pakistan, they have reduced the fund of one refugee from 24 to 35% in different fields, like in education, in health, in different fields. They have reduced the fund from 24 to 35%. Now, now they delete the fund sometimes. They use different tactics. Now, over here in Pakistan, Pakistan is alone tackling all Afghan refugees, and the fund which were delivered to Pakistan frequently, now it is being delayed. Now you can ask and confirm this news from my UN friend who were there in the studio, but it's true that they are using delaying tactics, putting pressure on Pakistan in different ways. Which is not good. I think the UN should come forward and resolve these issues, because at the end, the refugees are the one who is suffering from all this. Now, there is no permanent camp for, there is no permanent camp for the time period. They have no knowledge that for how many years or months they have to stay here or not. It's all depend on Pakistan government, which is not good. But the UN should should move forward and resolve those issues. And they are in critical condition now. In KPK, there are more than 1.5 million refugees. We still don't have any house to live. Now, weather is becoming strong, the cold is becoming more, so they will face their living standard will go down more.
Right. So Asif, I wonder how you view the challenge there as presented by Mirwais as well as Irfan. A, of course, on the issue of education, I want to get your thoughts, but B, also on the issue of simply just support from the international community, because you're in Bangladesh, and one of the issues obviously in Bangladesh right now is the issue of the Rohingyas. And obviously Bangladesh as a developing country would argue that it needs a lot more support to deal with that situation, but isn't getting sufficient support. How do you feel about that, Asif?
Yeah, thank you. I wouldn't really disagree with what's been said, and you're talking about, or the colleagues have been talking about Pakistan, and I think similar scenarios in other refugee-like situations. Again, I think it's part of the international politics. It's not just country politics. In terms of which countries get priority in terms of aid or in terms of humanitarian support, so different countries decide on either conflict situation or whatever countries are in crisis. And in terms of Bangladesh, I mean, I think in terms of education, what we've experienced, we've seen is like, okay, the Rohingya issue has been there for quite some time, from the 70s, but we've also had another group of refugees, Bihari refugees, for quite some time. Now that has now been sort of integrated, that community has been now more integrated into Bangladesh over many years now. But in terms of the Rohingya, they have been here since the 70s. So in terms of the registered official refugees, UNHCR and other agencies had sort of gone forward with an education program which is slightly using the local national curriculum, but also something that they're used to in Burmese language, as well as English and other basic language that they learn in, or basic education that they have in Myanmar. But having said that, they went up to grade 8. Now what happens after that? So that has been still an issue, and that was again for a small number of population, 30,000. Now, given the fact that now there's like 110,000 Rohingya refugees all over Cox's Bazar, down south in Bangladesh. Now, education is of course a big issue now, and there are different age groups as well in terms of before schooling, the preschool age group, but also then the older group. And what happens up to a certain level, whether they go up to 5th level or 8th, grade 8, the government will not really be encouraging them to get integrated into the national sort of education system. But at least they get some kind of schooling. And of course, UNICEF, but other INGOs and national NGOs have tried to deal with it. So yeah, it's a mix of trying out different approaches, but there's no kind of quick fix or quick solutions to that. And in terms of, again, I would like to mention that, even in Bangladesh, the UN and the international agencies, as well as the different countries, have been criticized. I am more sort of outside the sort of official system now when I talk about Rohingya issues. Yeah. So we have been critical of the role of the UN in terms of raising funds and how to balance in terms of the humanitarian aid versus the human rights issue. So in terms of Myanmar, it's still an ongoing debate how it's going to be resolved. But the international community has not been very, forthcoming in terms of looking at the political solution or the, looking at human rights issues, rather than just providing some kind of humanitarian support and washing their hands off that, yes, we are doing our bit, which is not enough. So there is a lot of criticism within Bangladesh as well that the international community is not doing enough. It's not just about UN. It's not about NGOs, it's international community at large.
Okay, so Irfan, I wanted to ask you on that issue of education, Irfan, do you think that there is enough support or enough realization of how important education is for refugees?
Education is very important for everybody because it is one of the out-of-school children that are there. And this is the main challenge which the whole world is facing. And everybody is using the voice to minimize the out-of-the-school children. So education becomes the priority. As far as the refugees education is concerned, UNHCR is doing a lot to collect the funds and make sure that the funds. The funds constraints are there with the international community because they are not supporting to extent which is required.
As far as the government is concerned, the government is still, the Pakistani government is in the tripartite agreement, and that is a very much term-based. And solution is still out there. Government welcomes refugees to take admission in the regular schools. But when they take the admission in the regular government schools in Pakistan, then they have to follow the curriculum with the medium of instruction, which is not very much acceptable among the communities, among refugee communities. UNHCR is also providing some scholarships under the TAFI for the children who have grown up and they are able to attend the universities. So every year there is a good number of scholarships also are there, but the support is still very low because in refugees we need to develop the teachers, the qualified teachers, and still the number of students is not very much bigger there, especially in the girls' education. We don't have the much qualified teachers which are required at the camp level. Like in one of the Mohammed Sain camps, we have only one school for the girls. And rest in a couple of the schools, the girls are attending the boys' school. So teachers development, quality management, provision of the textbooks and other teaching learning material, that requires some more support.
I was wondering, what is your experience when it comes to observing education for refugees? What kinds of schools have you observed set up for refugees?
Sir, my experience is that, sorry to say, but most of the programs which run through NGOs, to UN, different countries, was not necessary. Suppose I just want to respond to my brother Irfan over there in Quetta, because I belong to Quetta too. So I know the region. 60% of Afghan refugees over there in Quetta are they're working and then earning. There's no program for them. Now, most of the programs which is run through NGOs, because they spend a lot of money on on such programs which have got no use. So if they spend the money on right path, I'm sure that the problem will be much lesser than now. But the problem is they spend most of the money on such programs which got of no use. So that's the main key problem over there. Suppose they are giving cycles or some kind of such kind of things to different refugees over there. How can they get help from a cycle over there or motorcycle bike from over there? So they need to do a proper work in resolving their issues. And only then, if they put their money on the right path, only then they can resolve those issues. I think that they should go for a permanent solution for that. For example, if they build a small company or factory over there, and they learn from there, and they work there and then earn from there, that will be more beneficial because they can even the UN can earn from those places. They should start such kind of programs.
Okay, so Asif, what's coming out of the conversation essentially is the fact that there isn't enough understanding of the ground realities, seemingly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but do you think that that's true, that be it the United Nations or other agencies, do you think that they come in with preconceived notions about how to approach certain communities, be there in Pakistan, be there in Bangladesh, be there anywhere else in the world, about how to deal with those set communities?
I would expand that from the UN actually, like international NGOs. International framework. It's not just UN; it's INGOs as well. Some of them are large, some of them are smaller INGOs, or even in Bangladesh we have seen international missionary organizations coming in for support. And the people who come in, yes, some of them do not have a very clear understanding of what needs to be done, or they have had some experience and they know that, okay, we know best what to do. That has been the experience in Bangladesh, but I've heard from other people in other countries as well that this has happened. So it's one issue about the agencies, what understanding they have of the refugee needs and the humanitarian support that's required, but also the individuals who come in. They do come in with certain expertise, but not necessarily the whole package, or they know how to respond, or even how to behave with people. So that is an issue that needs to be, considered as well as monitored. And then again, in terms of the government also, and the local resources, that's not enough utilized. Again, it's like certain international experts, technical experts coming in from abroad. And this is not just in the humanitarian sector. In the development work in our countries, we do see a lot of technical experts coming in from abroad. They do bring in certain expertise, but not necessarily they understand fully the local context, A. And B, they come for a certain short period of time, few months, 9 months, or a year, or 6 months. For that short period of time, if you're coming from a different part of the world, it's very difficult for you to really internalize and really respond to the way you need to. So that I think is like an overarching issue that we have faced in our countries for a long time, in the refugee situation now as well, but also in other development work as well. So we probably need to reinforce the government mechanisms,
right,
but also the local NGOs and local capacities, so that it's slightly more sustainable. It's not a one-shot thing, or
right,
you give a dose for a few months and go back. It doesn't work that way.
Okay, so Irfan, do you agree with the criticisms of the need for a more permanent solution, especially in the context of when you had mentioned the UNHCR and its work in supporting the refugees?
I agree with my brother, because it is whenever there is a short-term support or short expertise there, that do not work a lot. And on the other side, the government is not very much prepared, because still the government has not developed the policies to manage the refugees. And it is so far as on the emergency footing. On the other side, the prevailing security conditions, the government is taking critical measures like the National Plan of Action and the approval from the Afghan and all these. These are the procedures.
Irfan, Mirwais, I'll go to you. What do you make of the challenges right now when it comes to, again, the UN agencies or other agencies working in Pakistan or anywhere else? There is, as you mentioned as well earlier, I believe, about corruption, financial corruption especially, and how money is spent. If you could expand on that for us a bit.
There is a thing, there are many programs in UN, in different NGOs, which are running, often which are not of any use. So what they did, there are some programs, somebody come from with some proposal and then accept it. Now just giving a training to them and spending a huge amount of money on those trainings. Now, you cannot learn something from in 15, 20 days, 25 days. So they spend a lot of money on different trainings. In my point of view, they should build some kind of factory or company which can create jobs where the refugees can work, and even the UN can earn from, the NGO can earn from those projects. There are many projects which they can use. They can utilize those projects for the betterment of refugees. But there is corruption going on because they are purchasing, suppose as $100 things, they are purchasing in $600 because the money is coming from somewhere else. So they don't go for a proper thing. There is no proper audit. And unfortunately, the big threat in Pakistan is that some of the community, the international community, are using these NGOs as their spy company, which affect the NGOs a lot, and which got true because the Pakistan intelligence got proof that there are many NGOs which are involved in spying things or collecting data for CIA and other agencies, which is not good.
All right, so Asif, that's quite an important point then, isn't it, Asif? Specifically then, if we're talking about any political goals behind any such setups of any NGOs, Mirwais there spoke about spying, but I don't want to go that far necessarily. But do you think that there are other political goals sometimes when it comes to these NGOs? And secondly, again, going back to that question that I'd asked Mirwais as well about corruption in general, it seems that that is quite seemingly rampant, isn't it, within the NGO community?
I can say from the Bangladesh experience that it has come up, but not a very blanket issue. Of course, there are certain NGOs, whether it's international, whether it's local, and some of them have been supported by UN and others. But what has happened is that at least from the government side, there has been sort of strong monitoring, at least for the, especially for the Rohingya issue. I mean, if it's a very high-profile, issue and a challenge for Bangladesh, a lot of criticism about that, how the government deals with it. So there is government intelligence agencies present all over, particularly in and around the refugee camps. And I would say that they do partly a good job of sort of looking at who's coming in and who's doing, coming in for what purposes. Of course, when you have a very high time in a crisis, when there's like a lot of even individuals wanting to support, like we have seen in Bangladesh in 2017, August, September, a lot of chaos in terms of the humanitarian support, a lot of individuals coming in and with pickups and throwing food packets and all that. That was a bit of a chaos. And within that, of course, there are different elements that could enter. And we have seen or heard about different kinds of propaganda, leaflets and stuff like that. But at some point that had been controlled. What has been experienced in Bangladesh is that the Bangladesh government had to call in the army in terms of the humanitarian support to sort of bring in some kind of order. Of course, the NGO and the development community did not really like that much, that why do we have to bring in the military forces? But I think at least it brought some discipline. And then there is a mechanism in terms of, because it's a coordinated effort by both government and the international community, there's a check and balance there. And again, the intelligence agencies do monitor. Of course, the issue of trafficking has been, recognized in the last few months. Human trafficking, people or young girls and women disappearing, but not in a very large scale. But yes, you have to constantly be at it just to monitor who's coming in and with what intention. Rohingya refugee camps is now talked about as the largest refugee camp in the world now. And it's not very easy to deal with all the different complications, but yes, there is. And the issue of corruption, of course, there is. But we haven't heard of major issues there. It's more about their approach towards the humanitarian response, and also in terms of slightly some issues of abuse. I mean, I can mention that even for NGOs, the government actually identified few organizations, and they've been asked to sort of support with some of their documents and their financial situation, because government did not feel comfortable about the way they're operating. So 2 months back, there has been like 40 organizations who have been not really blacklisted, but listed to be monitored a little bit. So this has been the case quite often.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there at that, our final word. But of course, we appreciate all of you taking your time out to speak to us here in the scope. That was Asif Munir, migration and displacement analyst, professional experience he has with working within the United Nations system. He was speaking to us live from Dhaka. We were joined by Mirwais Khan, journalist, who was speaking to us live from the Pakistani capital. And we were also joined by Irfan Ahmed Awan, who was speaking to us live from Kuwaita, and he's the managing director at Society for Community Strengthening and Promotion of Education. As all of our guests mentioned, there are a number of course, challenges when it comes to the refugee issue in the context of be it Pakistan, Bangladesh, or anywhere else in the world, about how the camps are run, who is coming in to decide about how the refugees are dealt with, what kind of experience they have, do they really understand the ground realities, the real needs of the refugees, and then about protection of the refugees, human trafficking, et cetera, as well as the needs of the day, education, food, etc. We'll of course keep a very close eye on this very fluid and very open-ended conversation, but that's all for the moment. I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.